and welcome back to Ask Dr. Saira, the show where I answer your questions about spirituality, personal growth, and mental health. Today's question comes from Nikhil, and it's a very short question, but has a long answer. So here's the question. How long should I be grieving after my parent passes away? How long should I be grieving after my parent passes away? That's a complicated answer. So let's talk about grief. Let's start with this idea of grieving. So one of the things that I've been thinking about over the last few months is how we're taught and trained to have certain experiences in our lives. So, for example, how you're taught and trained that graduation is supposed to feel when you're in high school, how you're taught and trained that being in a relationship is supposed to look, how you're taught and trained what grief looks like in different cultures around the world. Grief, the way people grieve, or one of my teachers says, the way people perform grief, it varies, right? So in some cultures, it's very appropriate to express big emotions. In some cultures, it's appropriate to get really still and really inward. In some cultures, they might be, family and friends that kind of participate in your support system for a certain amount of time. So it depends, right? It depends on which part of the world you're in, which cultures influence your way of seeing grief, what your beliefs are about what happens after death. Like all of these things will affect how you grieve, right? What grief looks like for you. And so I would start by asking myself that question, is that, do I have some preconceived ideas of how grief is supposed to look, or how I'm supposed to grieve, or what's the right way to grieve? I think we've been taught that there's like a right way to grieve. And that I find super problematic, right? Because who gets to tell me that this is the appropriate way to grieve? Now, that said, I do want to talk a little bit about the stages of grief. So Elisabeth Kubler Ross came up with, researched and did a lot of work and came up with this model of grief. And she talks about the 5 stages of grief. Now, before I go into the stages, what I want to tell you is that her colleagues, she's passed away, but her colleagues who are still alive today are saying that the way that we understand her model is not what she wanted at all, right? So she was not trying to say that this happens and this happens and this happens. It's not a line. It's not a linear model, right? It's like this could happen and this could happen and this could happen. She also never believed or said that all of those stages have to happen for someone to be healthy grieving. She never said that. She also didn't say that there's a particular time that you spend in any one of those stages. So the way that we might have used her work, or the way that people have been using her work since she did the work, is not maybe the way she intended it to be used. So she was looking at what are some themes that come up when people are grieving? What are some emotional areas that seem to emerge in people when they're grieving? And so don't think of this as like a step-by-step. It's not that. It's also not here's the 5 things you have to do, right? Many people experience these 5 things, and maybe there are other things that she hadn't experienced or she hadn't researched because her work was primarily with a particular cohort, right? She didn't look cross-culturally necessarily in the way, like in the depth that would have been needed to actually validate that for every culture, right? So okay, that said, it is still a useful model. I find in my work with people, it's still a useful model. And the reason it's useful is because it helps people make sense of what they're going through and lets them know that they're not crazy. And I think that's what your question is, right? Like, how long should I be grieving? Is this normal? That's the question, really, under the question. So the the 5 elements of grief, maybe not the 5 stages or phase, 5 elements of grief. So we have, and in no particular order, right? So there is often shock and denial. The person's like, no, that's not happening. It's absolutely not happening. And again, that's a way of coping, right? With this incredibly painful information that there's just shock and denial that it didn't happen, or that it couldn't have happened. There's also, anger that can come up. So we can be angry at the person, we can be angry at ourselves, we could be angry at others, we could be like, I know when my dad was dying, I was like super angry at this one particular nurse. Like she got all my anger because I was really upset about the fact that he was dying, but it's like the anger came out in this particular way. So anger, shock. There's also sadness, which is the one that we usually think about when we think about grief, right? The tears and the deep despair, sadness. Then there's also what we call bargaining. So bargaining is a really interesting one because it's kind of like we do this thing where we say, well, maybe if I had done this, or maybe if they had done that, or maybe it could have gone different this way. And we're starting to think about like all the different ways that we could have prevented that person from dying, or all the different things that could have happened differently so that that person would still be alive. That's bargaining. And then at some point, we come to acceptance. Now, just because we've arrived at acceptance doesn't mean those other things aren't still going to be coming back, right? Those other four aren't going to show up. We can be in acceptance for, an afternoon, and then that evening feel the anger again, or feel the sadness again, or start the bargaining thing. Like it's all happens at the same time. So it's not like this happens and this happens. It can be happening simultaneous. And that's another thing that was mistaken in the way that we've interpreted her model, is that she said that it could just all be happening at the same time, right? You can feel angry and sad at the same time. So the question about how long should you be grieving after a parent dies? Now, the other thing about grief is that we have different rules about how we grieve depending on who died. So one of my friends is a friendship researcher, and she talks about how interesting it is that when a family member passes away, we somehow have a different, like as a society, we somehow respond differently to that person than if their friend passes away. And the friend might actually be the closest person to them, right? But they don't get the same sort of sympathy, I guess, for lack of a better word. They don't get the same sort of acknowledgement that they're grieving. So in your case, you're saying a parent. Now, one of the things I would ask myself is, what was my relationship like with that parent? So if you were on bad terms when that parent passed away, that's going to impact how you grieve, right? If that parent was living with you, or you were living with them, that's going to also impact how you grieve and how long you grieve, right? Because now the family dynamic in the home has changed. If that parent was going through a long and drawn out illness versus a quick accident type of death, those are also going to affect how long and how you grieve. So I would say that the fact that you're asking the question of how long should I grieve after my parent passes away tells me that someone told you that there's a right way to do it and that you're not doing it that right way. Someone told you that and you believe them, or you kind of pick that up with whatever's happening around you. Now, there are some kind of generally accepted timelines, but again, this isn't true for everyone, and I think we have to kind of expand our idea of what's normal, because remember, we're looking at this like one particular way of saying grief is allowed. But in my practice, what I've noticed is that the first year is really difficult for people because there's a lot of milestones in that first year, right? So this is the first birthday without them, the first child that's born in the family without this person being around, the first Christmas, the first Eid, whatever it is, it's a first, right? And that person's not there. And so that first year can be really, really challenging. And what I find is that family and friends really get that. And so during that first year, they'll check in, they'll make sure, they'll see how you're doing. But what I found is in the second year, it can in some ways sometimes be harder. Because in the second year, it feels like, well, everybody else is just moving on. And I'm still here holding this pain and holding this anger. And why is nobody else feeling bad? And so the second year can be, for some people, even more, and not even more difficult, but just as difficult, perhaps, as the first year in some ways, because now you don't have the social support. So I would say, in answer to your question, is that there's no right amount of time to be grieving. There's people who have passed away in my family 25, 28 years ago, who I still think about, and I still do the bargaining thing, and I still get angry or sad about their passing, right? So because these people had an impact on you. You love them deeply is why you miss them deeply, right? So I would say, Nikhil, grieve the way you need to grieve. There's no right amount of time. If it's going further than 2 years and you're feeling like it's debilitating, like it's actually stopping you from living your life, from moving forward, then absolutely reach out and get some support for that. But there's no right amount of time and there's no right way to do it. So that's my answer to that question. If you have a question that you want to ask about any of these topics, or something that we've talked about here sparked another question for you, let me know. Send me an email. And otherwise, I'll see you next time. Bye.